Somewhere in a vault, or a basement, or a shelf in the depths of Langley is a file. The woman who made it, once the most powerful female journalist in America, died under suspicious circumstances before she could publish it. Her name was Dorothy Kilgallen, and somebody very powerful did not want you to hear this story. In November 1965, Dorothy was just days away from publishing what she believed was the biggest story of the century, the truth behind the JFK assassination. She had told a friend it could get her killed. She'd bought a gun. But she showed up to work anyway, sat behind a desk on live television, smiled at the camera, and did her job. And then she went out for a drink, and nobody ever saw her alive again. This is Lost Women, the stories you think you know, and the parts they left out. Before we get into any of this, before the conspiracy, before the death, and before the files that vanished, you need to know who Dorothy Kilgallen actually was. Because most people who know her name mostly know her from one thing: a game show. A panel of 4 people sitting behind a desk trying to guess what strangers did for a living. She sat there almost every Sunday night for 15 years. Elegant, sharp, a little intimidating. And because television was still new and strange and exciting, she became a darling of evening programming. But the game show was never the point. Dorothy Kilgallen was, by almost any measure, one of the most powerful journalists in America. And not just powerful for a woman, powerful full stop. She had a column that ran in over 140 newspapers across the country. Millions of people read it every day. She covered murder trials that stopped the nation. She broke stories that no one else would touch. And she had been doing it since she was 17 years old. To understand why her death matters, and why it still matters 60 years later, you first have to understand what kind of person she was. Because she was not a person who stumbled into dangerous territory by accident. She walked straight toward it, every single time. Dorothy Mae Kilgallen was born on the 3rd of July 1913 in Chicago, Illinois. Her father, James Lawrence Kilgallen, was a respected newspaper journalist, a star reporter for the Hearst Corporation, one of the biggest media companies in the world. She grew up watching him work. She grew up in a house where the news was not something that just happened to other people. It was something you went out and found. The family moved around a lot, following her father's career. Chicago, then Indianapolis, then back to Chicago, and then New York. Dorothy went to high school in Brooklyn. She enrolled in the College of New Rochelle, stayed for 2 semesters and then left. Not because she failed, but because a newsroom came calling, and a newsroom was where she wanted to be. She was 17 years old. She walked into the New York Evening Journal and she never really left. James Horan, who worked with her during her days at the Journal, recalls that she stood out from the other young women who populated the newsroom at the time. There was something about the way Dorothy handled herself, he said. I had the opinion that she was born for the business. That soft, quiet way of hers hid a steel ambition and a drive and also a very keen intelligence. Her father had spent his career finding things out and putting them into words. Dorothy was going to do the exact same thing. She was just going to do it bigger. By age 20, Dorothy had already covered many grisly murders and notorious trials and had earned substantial stature at the paper. Then in 1936, something happened that made her famous almost overnight. The New York Evening Journal entered her into a race around the entire world against reporters from 2 rival newspapers to see who could make it back first. At the time, this was a very big deal. It was a direct nod to Nellie Bly, a journalist who had made history in 1889 by travelling around the world in 72 days to beat the record set in Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days. Nellie Bly was already a legend. Dorothy was being cast in the same mould. A young woman, ambitious, going fast and going far. And she won. The story ran everywhere. She turned the whole trip into a book called Girl Around the World. A movie followed in 1937. And then the Journal gave her the thing that would define the next 3 decades of her life. Her own daily column called The Voice of Broadway. The Voice of Broadway was not a gentle column. It was not polite. It covered show business and celebrity and New York nightlife, but it also covered organised crime, politics and murder. It went places most columnists wouldn't. And most importantly, it named names. At its height, the column ran in more than 140 newspapers every day across the whole country. In an era before the internet, before social media, before 24-hour news, that reach was extraordinary. Millions of people read what Dorothy wrote before they had their morning coffee. One biographer described the column as dealing with declarative name-naming, hardcore gossip about marriages, divorces, public drunkenness, pregnancy, political shenanigans, hiring and firing. Nothing was off limits if Dorothy thought it was true and the public had a right to know about it. She wrote about celebrities, she wrote about politicians, she wrote about mob figures, she wrote about affairs and scandals and crimes. And because she wrote for Hearst, she had access that most journalists could only dream about. She went to the parties, she knew the people, she sat at the tables where decisions were made. Ernest Hemingway, not a man who handed out compliments easily, called her the greatest female writer in the world. In 1941, Dorothy made her radio debut on a Saturday morning chat show called Voice of Broadway, which Newsweek reviewed as crisp and sparkling. However, it was the radio show she started with her husband, Dick Colmar, that would cement her as a radio star. The program was called Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick and ran for 18 years. They broadcast directly from their large New York dining room, and the show consisted of small talk centering around the couple's glamorous lifestyle. As the months went by, their loyal listeners knew the names of their staff, the dimensions of their table, the quality of their glassware, and a good deal about the social lives of the couple and the names of most of their close and equally privileged friends. They weren't exactly beloved. A significant part of their audience loved to hate them. And despite the show that they put on, the couple had a very troubled marriage. They lived quite separate lives while remaining united on matters involving the children or their business interests. Dorothy was frequently linked with other men, including the singer Johnny Ray, with whom she had a long-term affair beginning in 1956. In 1949, Dorothy made her TV debut on Leave It to the Girls, which was presented by a group of New York career women giving advice on life, love, and the battle between the sexes. But it was her next show that would make her truly famous. In 1950, Dorothy joined the very first panel of a new CBS television game show called What's My Line? The format was simple. 4 celebrity panelists would try to guess the jobs of ordinary people who came on the show. The guests would answer yes or no questions. The panelists would try to work it out. It ran for 25 years.
Time now for everybody's favorite guessing game, What's My Line? Brought to you by Remington Rand, makers of the world's #1 electric shaver, the Remington. Now, let's all play What's My Line?
At its peak, What's My Line was one of the highest rated shows on American TV. People loved it. It was smart and warm and funny. On the show, Dorothy was quick. She was witty. She had a way of asking the right question at exactly the right moment.
Miss Iverson, do you do something besides or in addition to massaging or pummeling or kneading?
Yes.
Do you use any implements in your work?
Yes.
Are you inclined to work on these gentlemen more above the neck than below the neck?
Yes.
Do you ever take anything off them?
I haven't seen anybody have so much fun on this program.
Here goes. Well, are these gentlemen in sort of tilted position rather than just lying down when you work on them?
Yes, sometimes they are.
Do you ever put any lather on their face
Yes.
or anything? Are you a lady barber?
And she looked incredible. Glamorous, always dressed perfectly, always composed, and always with an air like she knew something you didn't. But it was the love of the game and her fierce competitiveness that cast her in the role of villain. Her tone eventually came to be balanced by Arlene Francis, who had a warm and playful personality that audiences responded to.
Well, is it by any chance useful rather than beautiful?
It is useful.
It's practical?
It is.
Should every girl have one?
Arlene and 2 of the long-term male panelists, Bennett Cerf and Fred Allen, got on well, while Dorothy became an outsider. As Bennett said of her, Dorothy was always a reporter. We began to discover that things that we would talk about in our dressing room, clowning around before the show, would begin popping up in her column. We didn't like that. Where the other panelists saw a dressing room, Dorothy saw a newsroom. Where they saw a conversation between colleagues, she saw a story. One week, host John Daly announced that he was pulling Mike Wallace from appearing as a mystery guest because Wallace had just interviewed a notorious California gangster named Mickey Cohen, and Daly felt it lowered the tone of the show. Dorothy picked up the phone to her paper the moment she left the building. The next morning, it was on the front page of the Journal. Daly was furious. He told her he thought what was said between them was in confidence. Dorothy's response was straightforward. Not at all. I'm a reporter, and that was a big story. I certainly wasn't going to get scooped on my own story. He never forgave her. After that, Bennett recalled, the dynamic in the dressing room changed permanently. When she came in, any intimate conversation ceased immediately. On camera, it was no different. While Arlene Francis and the male panellists played for laughs, asking silly questions and letting mystery guests breathe a little before being identified, Dorothy played to win. If she had recognised the mystery guest at a restaurant the night before, she would ask exactly that. "Did I see you at 21 last night having dinner at the next table to me?" A yes, guess identified, game over. Her colleagues burned. The audience thought she was brilliant.
Have I ever seen you in the lobby of the Lancaster Hotel in Paris?
Yes.
Have you and I ever waltzed at the Waldorf for the March of Dimes? Did I ever buy you a tie? Have I ever seen you in Maxime's in Paris? One more question. Did you ever push an old lady down the stairs?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you Dick Widmark?
Yes, Dick Widmark, he's right.
Bennett put it plainly. Dorothy wanted to get the correct answer. She was dogged and persistent, and like a district attorney, she went ploughing ahead. That was why she was the villain of the show. However, her gameplay and even her reporting wasn't the sum total of her personality, even if it was the most defining part. After her death, Bennett said,
"Well, a lot of people knew Dorothy as a very tough game player. Others knew her as a tough newspaper woman. When she went after a story, nothing could get in her way. But we got to know her as a human being, and a more lovable, softer, loyal person never lived, and we're going to miss her terribly."
What makes his words land even harder is this. He wasn't just her colleague, he was her publisher. Bennett Cerf was the co-founder of Random House, and he was the man Dorothy had chosen to publish her book, the one she was writing about the Kennedy assassination, and the one she told people would be the biggest scoop of the century. Dorothy was on What's My Line almost every week for 15 years, right up until the night she died. The show gave her something that her column couldn't, a face that went with the name. By the mid-1950s, Dorothy had built a presence across every medium that mattered, print, radio, TV, all at once. And she was always, in every room, in every medium, exactly the same person, a reporter, watching, listening, working. That quality, the inability to ever truly be off the clock, made her maddening to the people around her. It also made her the best in the business. And when the biggest story of the 20th century landed on her doorstep, it was exactly that quality that made her dangerous to the wrong people. There's one more thing you need to know about Dorothy Kilgallen, the reporter. She had a track record of being right when everyone else said she was wrong. In 1954, Dorothy covered one of the biggest criminal trials in America. A Cleveland doctor named Sam Shepard had been charged with murdering his wife. The case was massive, tabloids everywhere, the whole country watching. Sam Shepard was convicted. Dorothy said the verdict was wrong. She said the trial had serious flaws. She wrote about it and she kept writing about it. She was not quiet. Most of the media moved on. Verdicts are verdicts, cases are closed. That's how it works. But Dorothy didn't move on. Years later, the case was reopened. Sam Shepard got a retrial. New evidence came to light and he was acquitted. Dorothy had been right. She had said the verdict was wrong before it was safe to say so, and she had kept saying it, and eventually the system caught up with her. This is not a small detail, because when Dorothy Kilgallen looked at the Kennedy assassination in 1963 and said there was a bigger story that no one was telling, that was not the first time she had stood in front of a closed case and said, "This is not right." It was just the last time. New York in the 1940s and 50s was a city where the entertainment business and organised crime were not two separate worlds. They overlapped. They shared restaurants, nightclubs and casino floors. The same people who ran the mob also ran the venues where the biggest stars performed. And everyone in that world knew it, even if nobody said it out loud in print. But Dorothy said it out loud in print. And the person who made that the most dangerous thing she ever did, before Kennedy, before Ruby, before any of it, was Frank Sinatra. Sinatra and Dorothy were not always enemies. For several years in the 1940s, they were genuinely friendly. They moved in the same circles, Broadway openings, Manhattan supper clubs, and the late-night world of New York celebrity. They were photographed together rehearsing for a radio broadcast in 1948. They got along fine, until 1956. That year, Dorothy published a multi-part series in the Journal called The Real Frank Sinatra Story. It was not flattering. It detailed his affairs with a string of women, including actresses Kim Novak, Lana Turner, Anita Ekberg, and socialite Gloria Vanderbilt. It was the kind of story that destroyed carefully managed public images, and it ran in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. Sinatra was furious. His response was not to sue. It was not to issue a denial. It was to go to war. He started mocking her at his live shows in New York, in Las Vegas, in front of packed rooms. He attacked her appearance, calling her the chinless wonder and comparing her to a chipmunk. He called her a female fink. He did this in public, on stage, with a microphone, to audiences who laughed.
I never met I've met many male finks, but I never met a female fink Until I met Dorothy Kilgallen. How's that for an opening? I wouldn't mind if she was a good-looking fink. But an Andy Gump of What's My Line is ridiculous. The town where she came from, they had a beauty contest when she was 17 years old, and nobody won.
And then he sent a tombstone to her office, to a journalist's workplace, as a message. Dorothy did not back down. She fired back in her column. He attacked again from the stage. She wrote again. The back and forth went on for years. A very public, very personal war between two of the most recognisable people in America. At one concert, a recording of which only became public after both of them were dead, Sinatra ended his set with a message for the audience. He told them, "If you happen to run into Dorothy Kilgallen, be sure you're in your car." He couldn't argue with the facts of her reporting, so he attacked her face instead. He threatened her. He sent her a symbol of death. Dorothy kept writing, because Frank Sinatra's connections to organised crime were not a rumour. They were documented. The FBI kept a file on Sinatra for 40 years, 2,400 pages. In those files, agents listed him as a messenger for the mafia and documented his ties to powerful mob figures. Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit, Carlo Gambino, Willie Moretti, and Joseph Fischetti, who had been an associate of Al Capone. Sinatra always denied it. He said, "Any report that I fraternise with gangsters and racketeers is a vicious lie." When police in Naples searched Lucky Luciano's home years after a famous 1947 gathering in Havana, a gathering of top mafia figures from across the country, they found a gold cigarette case. The inscription on it read, "To my dear pal Lucky, from his friend, Frank Sinatra." Chicago boss Sam Giancana wore a star sapphire pinky ring that Sinatra had given him as a gift. In government surveillance recordings, mob figures mentioned Sinatra's name frequently. The FBI never charged him because they never caught him committing an actual crime, but the associations were real, consistent, and documented across 4 decades. Sinatra had also been the bridge between the mob and John F. Kennedy. He had worked to get Kennedy elected in 1960, reportedly helping to deliver union votes through his connections to Giancana. He had introduced Kennedy to a woman named Judith Campbell Exner, who had an affair with Kennedy and later Giancana. So when Dorothy wrote about Sinatra's mob ties, she was not writing about a singer with some dodgy friends. She was writing about a man who was personally connected to powerful and dangerous figures in American organised crime, figures who would later be at the centre of questions around Kennedy's death. Dorothy knew this. She wrote about it anyway. Before we go any further, let's do a segment I like to call a Lost Women Crash Course. This crash course is about the mob, because they're going to come up a bit in the story, and we need to understand the real thing, not just the mob from the movies. The American Mafia in the 1950s and 60s was not a colourful side story in American life. It was essentially a parallel government. It had its own rules, its own courts, its own way of handling disputes, including the ones that ended with someone dead in a car. It had more power over certain American cities than the actual elected officials did. And for decades, almost no one in law enforcement was willing to say so out loud. The American Mafia grew out of Sicilian organised crime that came over with Italian immigrants in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It took root in big cities, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and it built itself around the same things that have always made criminal organisations powerful: money, fear, and silence. The silence part had a name, omerta, the code. You did not talk, you did not cooperate with police, and you did not give up the people above you, ever. Breaking omerta was not just a betrayal, it was a death sentence. Through Prohibition, the period from 1920 to 1933 when alcohol was illegal in the United States, the mob exploded. Bootlegging made men extraordinarily rich. Al Capone in Chicago became a legendary criminal, and with that money came power, over politicians, over police, and over judges. When Prohibition ended, the money did not stop. It just moved. Into gambling, into loan sharking, lending money at brutal interest rates to people with nowhere else to go, into construction, waste disposal, the docks, the entertainment business. Wherever there was money to be made or pressure to be applied, the mob found a way in. By the 1950s, the American Mafia operated through around 24 crime families spread across the country. In most cities, there was one family. In New York, the centre of everything, there were 5. They were known simply as the 5 families. The Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, and the Bonanno family. Each one controlled its own territory. Each one had a boss called the Don who sat at the top. Below him were underbosses and lieutenants. At the bottom were the soldiers, the men who actually carried out the work. Above all of them sat something called the Commission. The Commission was created in 1931 by a man named Lucky Luciano. Luciano understood that the constant wars between the mob families were bad for business, so he built a governing body. Think of it as a board of directors for crime. The bosses of the most powerful families held seats. They voted on major decisions. They settled disputes. And crucially, any killing of a high-ranking figure had to be approved by the Commission first. You could not just go and murder a boss. You had to get it sanctioned. It was, as one author put it, an underworld Supreme Court. Outside New York, the two most powerful operations were the Chicago outfit, led in the 1960s by Sinatra's friend Sam Giancana, and the New Orleans family, led by Carlos Marcello. Both men were major figures. Both men will come up again in this story. Here is the most bizarre thing about all of this. For decades, while the mob ran gambling operations in a dozen cities, while they fixed boxing matches and corrupted police departments and controlled entire industries, the director of the FBI stood up in public and said the mafia did not exist. J. Edgar Hoover had been running the FBI since 1935. His official position for most of his career was that organised crime on a national scale was simply not real. He pointed the FBI's resources at communists and political subversives instead. At one point, the FBI's New York office had 400 agents assigned to hunting subversives and just 4 assigned to investigating organised crime. 4. In New York, in the 1950s. Historians have argued about why Hoover took this position. Some say it was institutional. Admitting the mob existed would mean admitting the FBI had failed to stop it. Some point to the fact that the mob may have had information about Hoover's private life that he did not want to be made public. And in the decades since, information about his private life has come to light that would indeed have ruined him. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. While Hoover looked the other way, the American Mafia grew into the country's most powerful criminal organisation. Then came 1957, and a very unfortunate gathering in upstate New York. On the 14th of November 1957, a New York State trooper named Edgar Croswell was driving past a property in the small town of Appalachian when he noticed something odd. The driveway was full of expensive cars from out of state, a lot of them. He called for backup. His colleagues set up roadblocks on the roads around the property, and then the men inside, who had gathered for what was, in effect, a national summit of the American Mafia, tried to run. 58 of them were caught. The rest fled on foot through fields and woods in their suits. The men who were arrested weren't foot soldiers, they were bosses. They had come from New York, Chicago, Florida, Texas, California, from across the entire country. There was no innocent explanation for this. 100 senior organised crime figures did not gather in a farmhouse in upstate New York for a book club. The Appalachian meeting, as it became known, was proof, undeniable, public, photograph proof, that a national organised crime network existed and had been operating for years. Hoover's position became impossible to hold. He was forced to acknowledge the mafia's existence and put together a dedicated task force to investigate it. For the FBI, it was an embarrassment. The nation's top cop had been either lying or blind for 30 years, and now everyone knew it. 6 years after Appalachian, the mob's walls of silence cracked from the inside. In 1963, a man named Joseph Valachi sat down in front of a US Senate committee and did something that had never been done before. He was a soldier, a low-ranking member of the Genovese crime family in New York, and he talked. He talked for days, on television, guarded by 200 US Marshals. He described the structure of the 5 New York families in detail. He named the bosses. He explained how the hierarchy worked, the Don at the top, the underbosses, the lieutenants, then the soldiers below them. He described initiation ceremonies. He described how murders were sanctioned. He used the term that mob members use for the organisation among themselves, Cosa Nostra, our thing. It was, Robert Kennedy called it, the biggest single intelligence breakthrough in the fight against organised crime, and it happened in October 1963, 6 weeks before John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. The timing matters, because by late 1963, thanks to Appalachian and Valachi, the American public finally understood what the mob was, how it worked, and how deep its roots went. The world Dorothy Kilgallen was reporting in was a world that had just woken up to the fact that organised crime was not a fringe problem. It was woven into the fabric of American life. And it was angry, because the Kennedys had been going after it very hard. But that part of the story comes a little later. On the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot dead in Dallas, Texas. He was riding in an open motorcade with his wife Jackie and Texas Governor John Connally through Dealey Plaza, waving to the crowds lining the street, the roof of his limousine open to the clear Texas sky, when shots rang out. He was struck twice. One bullet entered the back of his neck, another struck his head. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked on him for 30 minutes before pronouncing him dead. He was 46 years old. John Connolly, riding in the seat in front of Kennedy, was also hit and seriously wounded, but survived. The country stopped. 45 minutes after the shooting, a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippett was standing on a street corner when a man approached him and shot him 4 times at close range. Tippett died at the scene. Witnesses reported seeing a man flee. That description led police to a nearby movie theatre. Inside, they found Lee Harvey Oswald, allegedly carrying a handgun. They arrested him on the spot. Oswald was 24 years old, a former US Marine with an unusual history. In 1959, he had defected to the Soviet Union, lived there for nearly 3 years, married a Russian woman named Marina, and then returned to America in 1962 with his wife and young daughter. By the summer of 1963, he was in New Orleans handing out pro-Castro leaflets on the street and getting into public confrontations over it. The authorities said he had fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, a building where Oswald worked overlooking the parade route. A rifle was found on that floor. Oswald's palm print was on it, along with boxes next to the window. But Oswald never made it to trial. He never had the chance to tell his story publicly, to be cross-examined, and to have evidence tested against him in a courtroom. Because 2 days after his arrest, as he was being transferred from Dallas Police Headquarters to the county jail, in front of a crowd of officers and a live television camera broadcasting to the entire country, a man stepped out of the crowd and shot him at point-blank range.
There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
That man was Jack Ruby. He ran a Dallas nightclub called the Carousel Club. He had connections to organised crime going back years. And he had, according to people who knew him, been seen wandering freely in and out of Dallas Police Headquarters in the 2 days between Kennedy's assassination and Oswald's transfer. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody had asked why he was there. Oswald died in hospital that afternoon. Just like that, the only man charged with killing the president was gone. And with him, any chance of a trial, any chance of testimony, any chance of finding out, officially, legally, on the record, what Lee Harvey Oswald actually knew. Dorothy Kilgallen watched all of this. She had known Kennedy personally. She had visited the White House, and Florence Pritchett Smith, her close friend, had been one of Kennedy's mistresses. She was not just a journalist watching a story. She was watching the death of someone she knew. And from the very first day, something felt wrong to her. 1 week after the assassination, Dorothy published a column. Not a grief piece, not a tribute like appeared in so many other papers. A column with questions in it. She wrote about Jack Ruby. She wrote, "I'd like to know how, in a big smart town like Dallas, a man like Jack Ruby can stroll in and out of police headquarters as if it was a health club at a time when a small army of law enforcers is keeping a tight security guard on Oswald. Security, what a word for it." Most journalists at the time were not asking questions like that. They were reporting what they were told. The lone gunman, move on. Dorothy didn't move on. Just before Jack Ruby's murder trial began, Dorothy wrote that the government had refused to provide Ruby's defense counsel with certain information about Oswald. She described the refusal as Orwellian. "It makes you think, doesn't it?" she commented. "It appears that Washington knows or suspects something about Lee Harvey Oswald that it does not want the rest of the world to know. Who is Oswald anyway?" The difference between Dorothy and other journalists is she had something most of them didn't. She had people on the inside who trusted her enough to talk. She had a source inside the Dallas Police Department, someone who gave her the original police radio log from the day of the assassination, the full minute-by-minute record of what the department said and did from the moment the shots were fired. She used it to catch Police Chief Jesse Curry in a lie. The log showed that Curry's first reaction to the shots in Dealey Plaza was to radio his men and tell them to get someone on top of the overpass, not the book depository. The following day, he told reporters his initial instinct had been that the shots came from the book depository. Dorothy had the radio log. She knew that wasn't true, and she published it. In September 1964, after a 10-month investigation, a government panel set up by the new president, Lyndon Johnson, to look into Kennedy's death, called the Warren Commission, released its final report. Its conclusion: Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. There was no conspiracy. Dorothy read it and called it laughable. At a time when almost every major journalist and news outlet in America went along with the Warren Commission's findings, Dorothy Kilgallen stood up and said, "This is not right. The official story does not hold, and I am going to find out what actually happened." She told her attorney, Morton Farber, exactly what she planned to do. "I'm going to break the real story," she said, "and have the biggest scoop of the century." She told a TV producer friend, "They've killed the president. The government is not prepared to tell us the truth, and I'm going to do everything in my power to find out what really happened." This was the real Dorothy coming out, the journalist who could smell the truth from a mile away, the reporter who'd been right so often before. In 1964, a month before the Warren Report was even released publicly, Dorothy published something extraordinary in her column. She published the secret testimony Jack Ruby had given to the Warren Commission. Nobody was supposed to have that. It was classified. It had been given in a closed session, and Dorothy printed it. The transcript was shocking for two reasons. First, the questioning of Ruby by the Commission had been, in Dorothy's words, and by any reading, shockingly bad. The men charged with officially investigating the murder of a president had asked Ruby almost nothing useful. Second, and this was the thing that really landed, Ruby had told the Commission something important. He had said directly, "I want to tell the truth, and I can't here." He had pleaded with them to move him out of Texas to somewhere he could speak freely. He said there were things he knew that people might not want to come out. The Commission turned him down. They left him in Dallas. And they moved on. Dorothy printed all of it. The FBI opened an investigation to find her source. 2 agents came to her door personally to demand she give up the name. She made them tea, and she told them nothing. She then wrote about their visit in her column and added this line: "The FBI might have been more profitably employed in probing the facts of the case rather than how I got them." She was told the FBI was coming for her, and her response was to write about it in the newspaper and suggest they had their priorities wrong. Another one of the stories Dorothy broke during this period is one that has never been explained properly. A journalist named Thea Waldo, who worked for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, had discovered something. 8 days before Kennedy was assassinated, Jack Ruby had met privately with Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit and a man named Bernard Weissman. Tippit was the officer Oswald was later accused of killing during his flight from the scene. Weissman had placed a provocative anti-Kennedy advertisement in a Dallas newspaper the morning of the assassination. 3 men with direct connections to the events of November 22nd meeting privately 8 days before it happened. Waldo had the story, but he was too scared to publish it. Dorothy ran it on the front page of the Journal. She later revealed that the Warren Commission had also been tipped off about this meeting, and that their informant had added something the Commission never publicly pursued. There was a 4th man at the gathering, an important figure in the Texas oil industry. The Commission never identified him. Dorothy was also finding and publishing witnesses that the official investigation had either missed or ignored. On the 25th of September 1964, she published an interview with a woman named Aquila Clemens, a witness to the shooting of Officer Tippit. Clemens told Dorothy she had seen 2 men running from the scene. Neither of them matched Oswald's description. She also told Dorothy, "I'm not supposed to be talking to anybody. Might get killed on the way to work." In early 1964, Dorothy went to Dallas to cover Jack Ruby's murder trial in person. She used every bit of her celebrity and power to get something no other reporter managed to get, a private interview with Ruby. 2 of them, in fact. Sitting alone with the man who had killed the only suspect in the Kennedy assassination, in a room without microphones or other press. Whatever Ruby said to Dorothy in those sessions, he said to her alone. She wrote about what she observed. Jack Ruby's eyes were as shiny brown and white bright as the glass eyes of a doll. He tried to smile, but his smile was a failure. When we shook hands, his hand trembled in mine ever so slightly, like the heartbeat of a bird. She never told anyone what Ruby actually said to her in private. Not her editor, not her husband, not her lawyer. She was saving it for the book she was writing. The Ruby interviews were going into the book, and nobody was getting that information before she was ready. After Dallas, people close to Dorothy noticed something. She was carrying a file with her everywhere she went. A thick folder that didn't leave her hands in public and was kept locked at home. She told more than one person that the file contained information that could get her killed, and she wasn't being dramatic. By 1965, Dorothy's investigation had led her towards New Orleans, specifically towards a man named Carlos Marcello. Marcello was the boss of the New Orleans mob that we talked about earlier, and Dorothy believed Marcello was at the center of what had happened in Dallas. She was going to New Orleans to dig into it directly. She told a close friend that she would be going to New Orleans in 5 days and that it was cloak and daggerish. She had also, sometime in the weeks before her death, bought a gun, because she understood that what she was getting into was dangerous. She knew the risk. On the 3rd of September 1965, Dorothy published her final column on the Kennedy assassination. She wrote about unanswered questions around the photographs taken that day. She wrote about Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey's widow, and what she might still know. And she closed with a line that reads very differently now than it probably did then. This story isn't going to die as long as there's a real reporter alive, and there are a lot of them. She was dead 2 months later. Dorothy was digging into the Kennedy assassination because she believed the official story was wrong. And if someone silenced Dorothy Kilgallen to stop her finding the truth, then understanding who killed Kennedy is the same as understanding who might have killed her. Nobody has ever been charged. Nobody has ever been convicted. There is no smoking gun. There is no definitive answer. What we have are facts, patterns, and questions that have never been answered. So let's go through every serious theory on the table, the facts behind it, the motive, what we know, what we don't, starting with the official story. Theory 1. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone. This is the position of the United States government. The Warren Commission, after a 10-month investigation, concluded in September 1964 that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and that he acted entirely alone. The Warren Commission's key finding was the single bullet theory, the idea that one bullet shot from the book depository by Oswald entered President Kennedy's upper back, exited his throat, and then struck Governor Connolly, passing through his right armpit, shattering his 5th rib, exiting his right chest, shattering his right wrist, and ultimately lodging in his left thigh before coming to rest in near pristine condition on a hospital stretcher. Critics called it the magic bullet theory because it is physically impossible. The biggest blow to this theory came in the form of a home video. A man called Abraham Zapruder was filming Kennedy on his own camera at the moment he was assassinated. The Zapruder film, as it came to be known, has been studied frame by frame. The most important part of it is that when Kennedy is first shot, his head jerks backwards, indicating that he was hit from the front, the area of the framed grassy knoll where many believed a second shooter was located. There is also the question of whether Oswald was even on the 6th floor of the book depository at the time of the shooting. A secretary who worked in the building, Carolyn Arnold, said she saw Oswald on the 2nd floor just 15 minutes before the shots were fired, and within 90 seconds of the assassination, a Dallas police officer encountered him on that same 2nd floor, calm, not out of breath, buying a Coke from the vending machine. The Warren Commission said he had run down 4 flights of stairs in that time and composed himself completely. You can decide how plausible that sounds. The lone gunman theory is considered by most people to be bogus, but the Johnson administration and the Warren Commission had a vested interest in pushing the theory and closing the book on the story. Oswald never stood trial. He never told his story publicly. He was shot 2 days after his arrest on live television. It will never be known whether he was in some way part of the plot or a totally innocent patsy. Whatever Oswald knew or didn't know died with him on the floor of the Dallas Police Headquarters. Theory 2. The mob. We already did a crash course on the American Mafia and how it worked. Now here is why it sits at the centre of many serious JFK theories. 3 mob bosses are most frequently named: Sam Giancana, head of the Chicago outfit, Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans boss, and Santo Trafficante Jr., who ran organised crime in Florida and had deep ties to Cuba. The motive is not hard to find. The Kennedy brothers, JFK and Robert, have made destroying the mob a central project of their time in power. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, had run an aggressive organised crime prosecution campaign. He had wiretapped mob figures, gone after their businesses, and made their lives very difficult. The mob felt that they had helped get Kennedy elected through union connections, through Giancana's ties in Chicago, and through Frank Sinatra, and had been stabbed in the back in return. Marcello's feelings about the Kennedys were particularly intense. After being grabbed and deported without warning in 1961, he had reportedly told an FBI informant, "You don't cut off the tail of a dog to stop it from biting you. You cut off its head." The dog was Robert Kennedy. The head was the president. Marcello, Trafficante, and Giancana all had the motive, the means, and the contacts to have organised the assassination. And Ruby, the man who killed Oswald, had documented ties to organised crime. He had mob connections in Chicago going back years. When he killed Oswald on live television, he silenced the only man who could tell the world what had actually happened. Whether he did it on orders or of his own volition, the effect was the same. Theory 3. The CIA. Kennedy had humiliated the CIA badly at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. The Bay of Pigs was a CIA-planned invasion of Cuba that failed catastrophically because Kennedy refused to authorize the full air support the agency had been counting on. Afterwards, Kennedy reportedly told aides he wanted to scatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He fired the CIA director, Alan Dulles. The relationship between the president and the agency was, by any account, deeply broken. Then there is the Oswald connection. For decades, the CIA insisted it had no meaningful awareness of Oswald before the assassination. Newly released documents, including files that only came out in 2025, have now proven that was a lie. A CIA officer named George Joannides was in 1963 running a covert operation out of Miami. He was the case officer for an anti-Castro Cuban exile group. 3 months before the assassination, members of that same group got into a very public street fight with Oswald in New Orleans over his pro-Castro leafleting. The confrontation made local news and local television. It made Oswald look like a communist agitator. The CIA were very much aware of this, but the CIA told every single investigation that Joanides had nothing to do with the Kennedy case. A congressional task force reviewing newly released documents in July 2025 stated directly, "The CIA has been lying for 62 years about the assassination of an American president." That is not a conspiracy theorist saying that. That is a statement from a task force of the United States Congress. None of this proves that the CIA killed Kennedy. What it proves is that the CIA was connected to people around Oswald before the assassination, knew far more than it admitted, and actively deceived multiple government investigations for over 6 decades. The question of why, whether to conceal involvement or simply to conceal embarrassing covert operations, has not been answered. Theory 4. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was Kennedy's vice president. The moment Kennedy died, he became president. The theory goes like this. By late 1963, Johnson was in serious trouble. 2 of his close political allies, Bobby Baker and Billy Sol Estes, were at the centre of corruption scandals that were getting louder. There were credible reports that Kennedy was planning to drop Johnson from the 1964 ticket entirely. Johnson, who had spent his entire career clawing towards the presidency, was about to lose his only real shot at it, and possibly face criminal exposure besides. He allegedly told his mistress, Marilyn Monroe, "Tomorrow those goddamn Kennedys will never embarrass me again." That's no threat, that's a promise. That one is a very serious allegedly. But he had motive, he had the connections. The assassination happened in Texas, his home state, where his people controlled the motorcade route, the security arrangements, and much of the aftermath. He handpicked the members of the Warren Commission, which reported ultimately to him. An FBI memo from December 1966, sent by Hoover to Johnson's own assistant, reported that the Soviet KGB had concluded, based on its own intelligence, that Johnson was responsible for Kennedy's death. That is not evidence that Johnson did it, but it tells you that people paying very close attention at the time were not buying the lone gunman story either. The counter-argument is straightforward. Johnson was ambitious and ruthless in politics, but there is a significant gap between political ruthlessness and ordering a president's murder. No direct evidence has ever linked him to a plot. Theory 5. Cuba and the Soviet Union. Oswald's profile made Cuba and the Soviets the obvious early suspects. Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union, a pro-Castro activist, and an apparent communist sympathizer. And the fear in the hours after the assassination, inside the White House, was real. Johnson and others worried that if it came out that the Soviets or Cuba had killed Kennedy, there would be enormous public pressure for a military response, possibly a nuclear one. Cuba had obvious motive. Kennedy had tried to have Castro killed via CIA plots and via a mob-CIA partnership. The Bay of Pigs had been an attempt to invade and overthrow him, and Oswald's public activities in New Orleans placed him squarely in the pro-Cuba camp. Both the Soviet Union and Cuba denied involvement, and subsequent investigations found no credible evidence of their direct participation. Oswald's Soviet and Cuba connections may have been real, or they may have been a constructed cover story. Depending on which theory you believe, those 2 possibilities point in very different directions. Here is where all of these theories connect back. Dorothy Kilgallen was not investigating one theory. She was pulling on every thread she could find. She had sources inside the Warren Commission. She had interviewed Ruby alone. She was heading to New Orleans to look at Marcello directly. Her file, the one she carried everywhere, the one she said could get her killed, likely contained material touching on more than one of the theories we just walked through. Whoever killed Kennedy had reason to fear what Dorothy was building toward. Sunday, November 7th, 1965. Dorothy Kilgallen got up, got dressed, and went to CBS to tape What's My Line, the same thing she had done almost every Sunday for 15 years. She sat behind the desk. She wore her usual elegant clothes. She was 52 years old, in good health, and 5 days away from a trip to New Orleans that she believed would crack the biggest story of the century. The show taped. Millions of people across America watched her on their televisions, and they had no idea that this would be the last time that they would ever see her. After the show, she went for a drink with a friend at a bar. Then, after midnight, she left and made her way to the cocktail lounge of the Regency Hotel, 7 blocks from her home on East 68th Street. At the Regency, she sat in a booth. A man joined her. He was not someone her regular circle knew well, a journalist named Ron Pataki, with whom Dorothy had a close relationship in the final years of her life. He later denied being there that night. The biographer who first identified him said, years afterwards, that she believed he had something to do with Dorothy's death. The bartender who was working that night was the last person on record to admit seeing Dorothy Kilgallen alive. Nobody knows how she got home. Nobody knows what happened between the Regency bar and her bedroom. The next morning, Monday, November 8th, Dorothy's personal hairdresser, Mark Sinclair, came to the house as he did most mornings. He was often the one to wake her. Dorothy stayed out late and slept in. That was the routine. He found her in the master bedroom. She was sitting upright in bed, fully dressed, still wearing the makeup and false eyelashes she had on for the TV taping the night before. A book was propped open on her lap, The Honey Badger by Robert Ruark. Sinclair said immediately that something was very wrong. Not because of how she looked, but because of where she was. The master bedroom was not Dorothy's bedroom. She and her husband Richard had been living largely separate lives under the same roof for years. They had their own rooms. Dorothy had not slept in the master bedroom for several years. And the book. Sinclair knew that book. Dorothy had read it weeks earlier. She had told him she had finished it and that she didn't like it. It was propped open in her lap as if she fell asleep reading it, but she had finished it weeks ago. He also noted that she needed glasses to read, but her glasses were not in the room where she was supposedly reading a book. Her hairdresser, who knew her daily routine better than almost anyone, said he knew the moment he saw her that she had been murdered. The initial cause of death given at the scene was a heart attack. Then an autopsy was done. The finding was changed to acute ethanol and barbiturate intoxication, circumstances undetermined. That phrase is on her death certificate. It means we do not know if this was an accident, a suicide, or something else. Now here is where the paperwork gets strange. The autopsy was carried out by a New York City medical examiner named Dr. James Luke. But when you look at the death certificate, the official document that records how and why Dorothy died, it's not signed by Dr. Luke. It's signed by a different doctor, Dr. Dominic DeMaio, a deputy medical examiner from Brooklyn. Dorothy died in Manhattan. Her body was in Manhattan. The Manhattan medical examiner did the autopsy, but a Brooklyn doctor signed the death certificate. When Dr. DeMaio was later asked about this, he said he did not know why his name was on it. He said he was not working out of Manhattan at the time. Dorothy had a prescription for one sleeping pill, Seconal, the brand named for secobarbital. The initial autopsy in 1965 found secobarbital and alcohol, enough, the medical examiner said, to have caused her heart to stop when combined. But the amounts of each substance were, in his words, only moderate, not individually fatal. Then in 1968, 3 years after Dorothy died, a new testing method was applied to saved tissue samples. The results found 3 barbiturates in her tissue, secobarbital, which she had a prescription for, amobarbital, which she did not, and pentobarbital, which she did not. Nobody has ever explained how they got into her body. And there was one more thing. In the glass on the nightstand beside her bed, investigators found a powdery residue. Barbiturate capsules, when broken open and dissolved into a drink, leave a powder. Nobody tested that residue in 1965. Nobody explained it, and nobody followed it up. In the hours after Dorothy's death, all of her JFK investigation material disappeared. Her notes, her files, the locked folder she had carried everywhere. The chapter of the book she was writing was gone. Not misfiled, not lost in a move, not passed to a lawyer or an estate executor. Just gone. There are accounts of men being seen removing materials from the house in the period between Dorothy's death and when the police formally processed the scene. Who those men were, whether they were FBI, CIA, mob-connected, or something else, has never been established. Before she died, it was rumoured that Dorothy had taken a precaution. She was worried about her investigation. She knew she was going somewhere dangerous, so she gave a copy of her JFK notes to her closest friend, Florence Pritchett Smith, the woman who had introduced her to Kennedy. Florence Smith was not just a socialite. She was the wife of Earl E.T. Smith, who had been US ambassador to Cuba under President Eisenhower. She was known to be one of JFK's numerous mistresses. She had access to information about the political world around Cuba, the CIA, the anti-Castro operations, that almost no one outside the intelligence community had. She and Dorothy had met on What's My Line and had become close friends. Florence Smith died 2 days after Dorothy. She had been sick with leukemia, but the backup copy of Dorothy's notes was never found. There was no real investigation into Dorothy's death in 1965. The authorities said it was an accident. The case was not pursued. A woman who the FBI had under active surveillance, who had published classified government material, who had privately interviewed the man who killed the only suspect in the Kennedy assassination, who had told multiple people her investigation could get her killed, and who was found dead with drugs she had no prescription for, was given a cursory review and closed out. In 2016, researcher and author Mark Shaw published a book called The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, laying out the case that Dorothy had been murdered. The Manhattan DA's office read it. In 2017, they announced they were looking into the case. 8 months later, they said they found no evidence of murder. They declined to discuss their findings or explain their methodology. Let's be clear about what is fact and what is not. Fact. Dorothy Kilgallen died on November 8, 1965, of a combination of alcohol and 3 barbiturates. Fact: 2 of the 3 barbiturates found in her tissue in 1968 were not prescribed to her and she had no documented access to them. Fact: she was found in a bedroom she hadn't slept in for years, wearing makeup and false eyelashes, and with a book she had already finished and without her reading glasses. Fact: the death certificate was signed by the wrong doctor from the wrong borough who did not know why his name was on it. Fact: every piece of her JFK investigation vanished directly after her death. Fact: her closest friend, who it's rumoured held a copy of her notes, died 2 days later. But the actual truth and who did this to Dorothy is unknown. The official finding is circumstances undetermined, and that is exactly what it is. But here is what Dorothy herself would say if she were writing this story. She would say, look at the facts, ask the questions, don't accept a closed case just because someone in authority says it's closed. She had been right before. Now that you know what happened to Dorothy and how she died, we need to talk about Marilyn Monroe, because the connection between these 2 women is not just atmosphere. It's not just 2 famous women who both knew Kennedy and both died young. On the afternoon of Friday, August 3, 1962, Dorothy's column ran in newspapers across the country. In it she wrote about Marilyn Monroe, who had been having a difficult and very public few years, and noted that things seemed to be looking up for her. Then she added this: Marilyn had proven vastly alluring to a handsome gentleman who's a bigger name than Joe DiMaggio in his heyday. She didn't name him. She didn't have to. Her readers thought they knew exactly who she meant. A handsome gentleman, a bigger name than DiMaggio. It could only be the president. However, Dorothy later told friends she was actually referring to Robert Kennedy rather than JFK. What makes this detail more significant than a blind item is what Dorothy had apparently done 3 days earlier. According to reports, before the column ran, Dorothy called the Department of Justice and asked whether Attorney General Robert Kennedy would confirm or deny an affair with Marilyn. She was reporting. She was giving him the chance to respond before she went to print. Bobby Kennedy's office did not confirm. Marilyn Monroe died that same weekend. She was found in her bed in the early hours of August 5th, less than 48 hours after Dorothy's column ran. Her death was ruled a probable suicide by barbiturate overdose, but the official suicide ruling rests partly on the assumption that she was in a fragile, self-destructive state of mind, and the evidence for that is shakier than it looks. Yes, she had a history of depression and prior suicide attempts. Yes, she had been dependent on barbiturates and alcohol for years. All of that is true and documented. But here is what is also true. She had just negotiated her way back onto the film Something's Gotta Give after being fired from it in June. She was due back on set that Monday, the day after she died. She had appointments scheduled for August 5th, including meetings with a 20th Century Fox producer and a lawyer to change her will. She was not winding down, she was making plans. And then there is the Kennedy situation. According to FBI documents, Marilyn had indeed been romantically involved with Robert Kennedy. When the press started getting too close, the very married Robert stopped returning Marilyn's calls. She had reportedly been told by Peter Lawford, Kennedy's brother-in-law, that Robert was cutting off contact with her. She was, by multiple accounts, furious. Not depressed, angry. Former LA Deputy Prosecutor John Minor, who attended her autopsy and interviewed her psychiatrist shortly after her death, told the LA Times, "There is no possible way this woman could have killed herself. She had very specific plans for her future. She knew exactly what she wanted to do. A woman making plans. A woman who was angry, not despairing. A woman who was, according to people close to her, planning to hold a press conference about the Kennedys and what she knew. She never got to hold it." The toxicology report on Marilyn Monroe found 2 drugs in her system at fatal levels: pentobarbital, sold under the brand name Nembutal, and chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative sometimes called a Mickey Fin, known to be used to knock people out. Her blood contained 4.5 mg% of pentobarbital. Her liver contained even more. The coroner said the levels were consistent with ingesting around 47 Nembutal capsules. There were anomalies in the autopsy that have never been explained. No pill residue was found in her stomach, which is unusual if someone swallowed that many capsules. The toxicologist decided not to run further tests and disposed of her organs before a complete analysis could be done. Her psychiatrist broke into her bedroom window rather than calling the police when she was found unresponsive, and there was a significant delay before authorities were called. Now here is the detail that matters most. Marilyn Monroe died with pentobarbital in her system in August 1962. Dorothy Kilgallen died with pentobarbital in her system in November 1965. But let's set the drugs aside for a moment and look at the broader picture. Marilyn Monroe had dangerous knowledge about powerful men. She had been romantically involved with at least one Kennedy, probably 2. According to people close to her, she was planning to hold a press conference in the days before she died to talk about the Kennedys and what she knew about Cuba and Castro. She died before she could do it. Dorothy Kilgallen had dangerous knowledge about powerful men. She was days away from going to New Orleans to pursue her investigation. She had told people it could get her killed. She died before she could finish it. Both women were found dead in bed in scenes that felt not quite right. Both died of drug overdoses, officially ruled accidents or probable suicides. Both deaths had anomalies that pointed towards foul play. Neither death was ever fully and independently investigated. Marilyn Monroe was 36 years old. Dorothy Kilgallen was 52. Neither of them had a reason, by any account from people who knew them well, to have taken those drugs in those amounts on those nights. Dorothy herself had written about Marilyn's death. She knew the official story didn't hold. She had noted the strangeness of it in print. And 3 years later, she died in a way that rhymes with it. 2 women, the same drug, the same powerful world, and the same absence of answers. So we know how Dorothy died. We know what was in her body. We know what was missing from her house. We know the case was never properly investigated. Now let's talk about who might have wanted her dead. We are not going to land on one answer. What we have are groups of people with documented reasons to want Dorothy Kilgallen to stop asking questions. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI for 48 years by collecting secrets about powerful people and using them to his advantage. A man who kept files on presidents, senators, and journalists. A man who had made himself untouchable. His relationship with Dorothy was documented and hostile. The FBI had Dorothy's phone tapped. This was not unusual for Hoover. He tapped a lot of phones. But it tells you she was on his radar and had been for some time. When Dorothy published the leaked Warren Commission testimony about Jack Ruby, the FBI's response was immediate. 2 agents came to her door personally. They wanted her source. She gave them tea and told them nothing. Hoover read her columns. We know this because in at least one documented case, he personally annotated one of her pieces about the JFK investigation, writing the word wrong next to her claims and sending a memo to his deputy. He was not ignoring her. He was watching her. And in the period immediately after Dorothy's death, before police had formally processed the scene, there are accounts of men removing materials from her townhouse. Who those men were has never been established, but the FBI had been actively interested in her JFK files. Hoover had motive. He had the means. The FBI had tools to monitor, access, and act that most people in 1965 couldn't imagine. And the pattern of his behaviour towards Dorothy, the surveillance, the agents at her door, the personal annotations, and the ongoing interest in her files is consistent with a man who considered her a serious problem. The CIA. We know the FBI was watching Dorothy. What is less well known is that the CIA was too. Both the FBI and the CIA kept secret files on Dorothy Kilgallen. The CIA file is harder to pin down. The agency has never been fully transparent about what it held on her and why, but its existence is documented. Here is what we know about the CIA's specific connection to her investigation. In July 1959, 4 years before Kennedy was killed, Dorothy had broken a story that put her directly on the CIA's radar. She was the first reporter in America to publicly allege that the CIA and organized crime were working together on a hit team targeting Fidel Castro. That story was true. It would later be confirmed by multiple government investigations. But in 1959, printing it made her a problem for the agency. Then Kennedy was killed, and Dorothy started pulling on threads that led directly back to that same CIA mob operation. The men she was investigating, Marcello, Giancana, Trafficante, were the same men that the CIA had partnered with to kill Castro. She had been first on that story once. She was trying to be first on it again. The CIA also had a direct interest in the Oswald question, the question Dorothy kept asking the loudest. As we covered earlier, CIA officer George Joannides had been running operations connected to people Oswald was in contact with in New Orleans in the months before the assassination. The CIA hid this from every investigation for decades. Dorothy was asking publicly and persistently who Oswald really was and what the government knew about him before Dallas. That was precisely the question the CIA most needed not to be answered. And then there is this. In October 2017, when a batch of long-sealed JFK assassination files was released to the public, one of the documents released was a file with a very simple title, Dorothy Kilgallen. Its contents remain sealed to this day, withheld on the grounds of national security. If Dorothy Kilgallen was just a columnist who got her story wrong and died of an accidental overdose, why does a national security file about her still exist? The mob. Carlos Marcello is the name most directly tied to Dorothy's final investigation. She was heading to New Orleans specifically to look at him. She had bought a gun because she knew what that meant. Marcello was not a man who responded well to scrutiny. And a journalist with Dorothy's reach and track record, who had already published classified government material and who was on her way to ask him questions, that would have been a very serious concern. The mob had motive, the mob had reach and a hell of a lot of experience. And Dorothy had told her hairdresser in the weeks before she died, if the wrong people knew what I know about the JFK assassination, it would cost me my life. Here is the honest summary. We do not know who killed Dorothy Kilgallen. We do not know for certain that anyone did, though the evidence is pretty damning. The official finding is circumstances undetermined, and it has never been changed. What we know is that she was about to publish something powerful, that she told multiple people it could get her killed, that she bought a gun, that she died with drugs she had no prescription for, that the crime scene had anomalies that were never explained, that her files vanished, that her closest friend died 2 days later, and the backup copy of the files disappeared. And we know that multiple groups of people had clear, documented reasons to want her investigation stopped before it was published. Dorothy Kilgallen knew she was in danger. She wasn't guessing, she wasn't being dramatic, she had been a journalist for 35 years. She knew what real danger looked like, and she had decided that what she was chasing was worth it anyway. What makes Dorothy's story so hard to let go of is not the conspiracy, it's her. It's the person she was. The woman who had been right about Sam Shepard when everyone else moved on, who had published classified government testimony and offered the FBI a cup of tea, who had sat alone in a room with Jack Ruby and kept what he said to herself because she was saving it for the book. She was not reckless, she was not paranoid. She was a careful, experienced, brilliant reporter who had spent decades being right about things and who had looked at the biggest story of the 20th century and said, "This is not right, and I am going to find out what is." But the files are gone, the notes are gone, the case was never properly opened. On her death certificate, in the space where it says cause of death, the words are circumstances undetermined. After 52 years of life, 35 years of journalism, 140 newspapers, 15 years on What's My Line, the Warren Commission, Jack Ruby, Carlos Marcello, a locked file and a gun, the best the official record can offer is, we don't know. Here is what we do know. Dorothy Kilgallen was the most powerful female journalist in America. She had broken stories no one else would touch. She had been right when every other voice in the room said she was wrong. And she had access that no other reporter had, and she was weeks away from putting it all together. Then she was gone, and the world moved on. That is not a satisfying ending, and it's not meant to be, because Dorothy Kilgallen did not get a satisfying ending, and the least we can do is sit with that. She deserved to finish the story, and so did we.